to building computers, one of the first little pieces of trivia you'll probably come across is that AMD CPUs use pin on the bottom, while Intel ones use little contact pads with pins on the motherboard socket instead. But why were these choices made? Do engineers at AMD just think that pins are prettier? Well, it turns out that the use of pins versus pads is a very deliberate design choice. You see, Intel's approach of having pins on the motherboard instead of the chip is called a land grid array or LGA. LGA typically makes it easier to fit more contacts into a smaller space on the CPU. Modern CPUs need lot of contacts for their high-speed features and to promote stable power delivery by spreading out the current. The other thought is that because tiny pins are very fragile, because they are super thin, well, it would be better to place those on the motherboard rather than the CPU. Because it's not uncommon to see a $400 CPU installed on a $150 motherboard. So, if one of those things was gonna break, you'd rather be at the cheaper one, right? Then you can reuse the CPU on a new motherboard. Now, of course, you can still mess up an LGA processor by touching the gold contacts on the bottom with their oily little fingers, but overall they're harder to damage than the pin grid array or PGA chips. The one favored by AMD are the ones with the pins on their undersides, and compatible motherboards for those have corresponding holes on their socket. Now, immediately you can probably figure out that this makes PGA chips a little bit easier to damage. However, there are some upsides to using this design over land grid array. For one, the pins on the PGA are a little bit tougher than the pins on the motherboard that you'd see in an LGA socket, meaning that they are easier to repair in an event that they do get bent, which I'm sure you can sympathize with if you have ever had the misfortune of having to re-bend even just one damaged pin on the LGA motherboard. The superior durability of the PGA pins means that they can typically handle a little bit more current than LGA packages too, which can be important depending on how the chip itself is designed. And for another advantage that you can more readily experience firsthand when building or upgrading your own PC, PGA chips tend to be a little bit easier to install since there are no super delicate motherboard pins to worry about, though of course you do have to make sure that you hit every hole in the socket properly. These advantages have led AMD to keep using PGA for its consumer level chips, even long after Intel abandoned them on their desktop chips way back in 2004. And even though the current 3rd gen Ryzen processors actually have more contact on the bottom than their Intel rivals, AMD still found a way to fit all those pins onto one package, partially because the processors themselves are physically larger. Now, as you might have figured out, LGA does allow you to cram more contacts per unit area. So, there are actually AMD chips that do use it. There are the Threadripper lineup for the higher end desktop PCs and the Epic lineup for servers, are both based on land grid array designs with over 4,000 pins. So if you're lucky enough to be using one of those monsters, definitely don't bend any of those delicate motherboard contacts. As for what all of this means for you, the consumer though, well, nothing. You shouldn't choose a CPU based on whether it is PGA or LGA. It doesn't really affect performance in the way that the architectural design or the clock speed or the core counts do. And the reason that Intel and AMD went separate ways is just because they value different aspects of these designs, since each one does have their pros and cons. It's just important to be aware of the pitfalls whenever you are installing either of them, so you don't mess up the bottom of your chip, unless you want a really expensive coaster. So if you liked the video, hit the like button and also don't forget to subscribe.